Hi, this is an instructional video, just a very coarse one initially to help you get up and running with the alpha release of mrMeshPy, which is a replacement for the mrMesh package for mrVista. For reference, we're using Debian Stretch here, MATLAB 2017, which is version 9.2, and I've got a very recent nightly mrVista source release from October 1st, 2017. So the first thing you're going to want to do is download the mrMeshPy repository from GitHub. I'll add the link below, but you can see it up here. I'll leave it up to you however you want to download that, where you want to put it on your local system and unpack it. Once you have that, you will need to start running the package. So I'm just going to change directory here to where I have it downloaded. Okay, so in this directory are a number of Python files and a subfolder with the MATLAB routines that are routinely used throughout the program. In order to launch the package, we just run Python. For reference here, I'm running Python 2.7. I'm not running Python 3 yet. So Python mrMeshPy.py. With any luck, that will launch our package. So here is the application. It looks a little bit like the old mrMesh window. Note that menu coming soon. Hopefully that's pretty self-explanatory, so those are just placeholders for now, but I have actually started building and enabling some of the menu functions here. So under ROIs, for example, there are some options that we'll be using a little later on. Okay, so that's running. If this isn't running, you might get some error messages. It might be because of the dependencies, so you will need Python Qt5 and Python VTK6 running as well. This won't work currently with VTK5 or Qt4. Okay, so we have that running now. What we want to do is start a MATLAB session. So like I said, I'm using MATLAB 2017A here, so version 9.2. Just wait for that to launch. Sorry, this is off screen because I've got two screens running at the moment, but it just saves a bit of real estate. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add the current Vista distribution to my path. This might be something that you do automatically, but I'm just doing that here. So I've got that in this folder, and it's the VistaSoft master branch that I downloaded from October 1st, 2017. Just waiting for that to add to my path now. And then I'm going to add the path for the mrMesh distribution that I've just, mrMeshPy rather, that I've just downloaded. So I'm going to add that. And it's just worth checking because there are a couple of crossovers here, if you like. Some of the functions that are embedded in mrVista I've had to overwrite. Well, actually there's just one, which is the mesh color overlay function. It just adds an extra attribute to the mesh that we use down the line. Okay, so this is telling me that mrVista is on my path and I've got the correct path to these additional functions, so they'll override the mrVista one standard ones. Okay, so now I'm just going to change directory to somewhere I've actually got some pre-processed retina topic data. So here's data for a particular individual. I'm not sure how you normally launch mrVista, but I normally jump straight into the grey view page once I've run. So I'll start mrVista in the 3-view mode. Okay, so that's opened volume view for me off screen, which I'll just drag that in so we can see it. In the meantime, I'll just minimize that window so we can see what's happening. Okay, so we have a mrVista session running. We have this control window for the mrMeshPy session, and we have a MATLAB window. Okay, so the one thing that we don't have running at the moment is the controller GUI window that will send commands backwards and forwards between MATLAB and the mrMeshPy session. So we're going to load the equivalent of, sorry, sorry about that. You may remember this window, so we do window, open 3D window rather, and that launches that little dialog. Well, of course, this is the dialog for Mr. Mesh. So what we've done is we've created a newer version of that. At the moment, there isn't a button in the main 3D window, so I just launch it from the command line by running GUI 3D window meshPy. So that's just a command that's now on the path. It's a subroutine in that MATLAB routines folder. Run that again. It's launched it off window, but here we go. So it launches this little dialog window, which shouldn't be too dissimilar, hopefully, from the 3D window option. And really, let's just get cracking. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to load a mesh that I've already built previously in older Vista versions. So I'm just going to load a mesh. This is going to go to the inat directory, and here's one that we've built before. So I'm just going to click that. Hopefully, with any luck, some things happen. I get some debug information in the window in case things crash. But a mesh loads in a new instance here, so a new tab in the mrMeshPy window. It launches upside down at the moment. That's something I'll fix in due course. It's just a camera setting. But okay, so for some basic interaction, I believe the key bindings on your mouse are still the same as they used to be in Mr. Mesh. So if you left-click, hold down your mouse in this window, and you drag it around, you can do rotation of the mesh. So I'm still holding the mouse down now. The right mouse button, if I right mouse button, click it down, and if I move it up and down, you can zoom in and out. If you roll your mouse wheel in the middle, it'll also zoom in and out. However, if you hold the middle mouse wheel down and you drag left or right, it actually changes essentially the origin about which the rotation happens in the window. So if I drag that off here and I rotate, there are different rotations. I think that's very similar to what Mr. Mesh used to do. The one thing that can happen when you do all this is you can get yourself in a big mess. An easy way to just get back to where things should be is if you click in this window, make sure it's got focus, and you just press R on your keyboard. That's a refresh or a recenter command, and I'll just recenter everything so you can get back to where things were. Right, so now back to this window. There's load a mesh. I'll just show you if we can load a second mesh if we want. So that's just popped up a dialog off screen again. We can load the right hemisphere. So that should hopefully, with any luck, plod through. And so there was the first mesh we loaded. Now there's a second instance, a new tab that should automatically open. So now we have the right hemisphere loaded. As with the Mr. Mesh application window, or the 3D window, we have this list of currently loaded meshes. They're not particularly intriguingly named, but at least they correspond to the names up here. Right, so let's select a particular mesh. Okay, so even though mesh 2 is in view here, I'm selecting mesh 1 to operate, and I want to do some smoothing on it. So that will run hopefully in the background, and what's happened there, hopefully you'll see that it's automatically flicked over from mesh 2 to mesh 1, and we have a smoothed version of that mesh. The smoothing iterations here are always relative to the initial vertices that are loaded, by the way. So if I did 10 smoothing iterations, it would essentially go back to the initial vertices and only perform 10 iterations. So if I re-smooth that same mesh, there is the mesh only smooth with 10 iterations, 20 iterations, 120 iterations. Obviously it just gets longer and longer every time, but it's still pretty quick. Okay, so we can do that on mesh 1, or we can do it on mesh 2. Should automatically send it, and mesh 2 has been smoothed now, so that's the right hemisphere. Okay, of course what we want is we want to be able to see, so here's some phase data overlaid, there's ring data. Wedge data is probably more useful in this instance, so here are some wedge data, and I'm working on mesh 2, the right hemisphere, and I actually want to update, so I want to send that information to my mesh. So I believe that's just like the update button rather on the old Mr. Mesh window GUI. Okay, so we have a mesh here, and there's some data overlaid. And if I change the ring data and I update, it'll send that over. So there is some data on the mesh. Now what may happen at this point, I so used to see this pretty routinely in the Mr. Mesh application, is the data that are displayed on this mesh end up being garbage. They just out of sync. The indexing isn't right. So I don't know how many of you have come across this before, but sometimes if it does, the pattern just doesn't look right. It is worth going in your volume window or your gray window to gray mesh display options and recompute vertex to gray map. That takes it a few seconds to run in the background. Of course, we're not going to see this change now because it's actually mapped correctly, but if you then hit update, it would send that map over, and well, indeed that actually did make a small difference there. So yeah, it may be worth doing that recompute before you send data over for both the left and right mesh. Anyway, that's something else to deal with down the line. Right, so we have some meshes. Let's update the left one as well. We have some data overlaid on there. And of course, one of the fundamental things you want to be able to do is draw ROIs on the mesh and transform them back into the volume space. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to do the drawing in this application first, and then we'll use MATLAB to pull it over afterwards. So why don't we show some, I've got that, let's show some wedge data on mesh 2. Okay, so hopefully that updates to wedge, and it's flicked to mesh 2. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in here. I'm going to use the middle mouse button to drag it across. Why don't we go nuts and actually let's make this a bit bigger. Okay, so here's my mesh. So the mouse buttons as they are at the moment is the left mouse button will keep rotating things even if I click on the mesh. This window here hopefully should be telling me something along the lines of when I click on a mesh that it's ignoring the left mouse click because I'm not currently in draw mode. Okay, so that's doing rotations. However, as soon as I enable draw mode, what it'll do is it'll stop rotating things, which is kind of handy because we might want to pick very specific vertices on here without rotating. So I'm going to do that now. So on this mesh, I'm going to go to ROIs, one of the few menu options that work currently, and we're going to enable drawing. And now when I click with my left mouse, if I click outside the brain, hopefully you can see here it's asking me, it's saying, it's returning essentially an error, and it's thinking that we're clicking outside the object, which is handy because we are. But what it's not doing is rotating anything anymore, so at least it's locked down the view for us so we don't mess up the recurrent rotation. And hopefully when I click here somewhere within the mesh, you'll see where I clicked the vertex has gone black. I click a bit further along, bit further along, bit further along, bit further along, and I'll just keep going around until I get to this point. Now, if at this point I wanted to look further around the corner and I wanted to rotate the brain, I can't do it because I'm currently in draw mode, so no rotation is possible. So what I can do is I can go to ROIs, I can temporarily disable drawing mode. Now when I left click, it'll keep rotating again. And then when I'm ready to draw again, I can go back to ROIs, enable drawing mode. Now I'm back in drawing mode. It's not going to do anything until I click on the mesh. And when I get to here, I can either right click to close the loop and to generate a new ROI mesh, or indeed I can go to the menu and click the close and fill button. Okay, I'm just going to use the right click in the window for the time being, and hopefully what you can see there is this has generated for us an overlay mesh. It's actually made a deep copy of the vertices, and it's just generated a new mesh which corresponds to the intersection of our picked points with the actual mesh below it. So there we have an ROI. Of course, what we want to do now is we want to transform that back into our volumetric data. So what we're going to do is we're going to say we're currently drawing on mesh 2. So let's on mesh 2, let's get the ROI. And hopefully what will happen now, it'll ask us for a name. So that's fine, we'll just leave it as ROI new. Click OK. Bunch of debug information in the background, but it's transformed the ROI into our volume view for us. And what it then does, actually, once it draws that ROI in the volume view, it automatically just sends it back to the mrMeshPy window for us and draws it so that we can actually see where the ROI has been drawn. So this boundary in blue here. What this hasn't done for the time being is get rid of that additional representative mesh of our original ROI, and so the way we can get rid of that is, for example, if we wanted to start drawing a second ROI, we'd just go to ROIs, start a new ROI. That will delete that temporary mesh. It'll leave the ROI boundary from the ROI that's currently visible in the volume view, and we can just start drawing a new ROI. So what I've done by doing start new ROI is I've got rid of the one that was there, but I'm not currently in draw mode yet. Okay, so my left mouse click is still making things rotate. So to actually enable drawing, I would do enable drawing. On my mesh, I would pick a sub-region of wherever I want to draw. Right click to close it. So now I've got a smaller sub ROI here, and what I can do is go back to the mrMeshPy window and get the ROI. That'll transform back. It'll ask me for a new name, and it'll transform it, and then hopefully send it straight back to this window. There we go. So now we've got, I'll just turn off that overlay as before. So now we've got a big ROI and a small ROI, and they're being rendered on top of the mesh. Just as a health warning, the transformation of ROIs from the mesh space into the volumetric space at the moment is only in the all layers mode. There are different ways to transform them in mrMesh, and those are works in progress. So you could do layer 1 only, for example, usually, but the only implementation I have at this minute is all layers, so just be aware of that. Hopefully that's enough to get you started. One other recommendation, one other sanity check is if for some reason this application crashes or MATLAB crashes, it's just worth closing both and just starting from scratch, because we're still working on just getting the referencing to make sure that there isn't kind of a mismatch between the indexing within this list and these windows. Like I say, it's a work in progress. This is kind of a first pass. I think we've convinced ourselves already that these maps and the overlays that we've seen in mrMeshPy are highly comparable, if not identical, to the representations that we used to get in mrMesh. And that's largely because we are using the same algorithms in VTK. We've just obviously embedded it within this application rather than the built MEX functions in mrMesh before. Right guys, hopefully that's enough to get you started. I'm sure I'll be hearing from you. You can email me directly. Enjoy!